Happy Independence Day. We're going to talk today about how to free our feet and some of the considerations that we need to keep in mind. A couple of visuals to help you keep in your imagination what it is that we're changing in our body as we make the transition to a naturally functioning foot that can control its own motion, doesn't need arch support, and is happy to be in minimalist footwear or barefoot. It's a process that can take from 6 months to a year and a half for your average person, but it's a way to overcome the posture deforming features of footwear that we've adapted to over our lifetime. I'm starting today with a couple of diagrams just to be able to talk about and share some of the relationships that we're trying to change when we are rehabilitating our foot, making it a more tactile appendage that gives us more options for movement and how we can hold ourselves. So the biggest thing, first of all, is to just talk about some of the shoe features that affect our normal muscle tension balance and the options that our nervous system has for coordinating all of that stuff. We've got two examples of footbeds here. First, we have what would be defined as a natural foot, or a foot that, such as being barefoot on plumb and level flat ground, we have the tips of our toes, the ball of our foot, and the calcaneus, our heel bone, all on the same plane. Most common shoes, especially athletic shoes, the kind that a lot of folks wear when we're strengthening, entrenching the coordination patterns that we have in our nervous system, how we mitigate the relationships between all of our musculature, we are often doing it on a footbed that's shaped like this. The two biggest things here is, first of all, we want to look at this is heel elevation. And this, or the lifting up of the toes in the front, is known as toe spring. So we want to think about what that does to the musculature of our foot. The integrity of our ankle and how stable, how many options for movement that we have, it's made up by the 360-degree wrapping of long tendons that come from up within the leg bones, crossing the ankle joint that help us either with ankle motion, dorsiflexion or plantar flexion, like we're pointing at the ground, toe extension and toe flexion. Now, this is a diagram. It's kind of a cut halfway down the leg here that shows us the relationship. This is the tibia, this is the fibula, and then each of these are the muscle bellies as they relate to each other, as well as the space between them. We were going to do a lot of thinking about the space between things today. So the first thing that happens, most shoes, even if the toes are flat on the ground, if they have heel elevation, and we take this foot and then I pull the heel up, notice what happens here at the ball of the foot. It places these joints into a state of extension. What that means is the muscles that pull our toes up are having to be short in some way to accommodate that extended motion happening at the toes. Most shoes, because they take some form of rigid material to create that heel elevation, what that rigidity does is it takes away the rolling motion at the joints of our tarsal bones and our midfoot bones. Each one of these little joints in here is there because we're supposed to move. But when we put something rigid underneath it, it takes the option for movement at those joints away, which means that as we walk, we're losing some of the ability to roll and flex and glide at all of those joints. And so often shoe manufacturers will then bend up the tip of the toe of the shoe in a feature called toe spring, which further imbalances those toe flexor and extensor tendons. Let me show you on the diagram. So we have our toe extensors. which come from our toes, cross the joint, cross the ankle, and come from the front of our shin bone. So that would be here. This is our extensor digitorum longus and our extensor hallucis longus. Hallucis is the word for big toe. So what ends up happening is these toe tendons get too short. But the other thing that we need to think about, it's not just what happens at the toe joints. As this foot goes into that state of elevated heel and these toes come up into extension, notice what happens at the ankle joint. The ankle joint or the foot starts to point downwards. It places the foot into a state of plantar flexion. So the plantar flexors back here are going to be soleus and gastroc, which attach to the heel bone. And then we also have the toe flexor muscles, which, because they cross the ankle joint and attach out on the tips of the toes, also have the role of helping us pull our ankle down or into plantar flexion. So those come from deep to the soleus. We have the flexor hallucis longus and the flexor digitorum longus, which come from behind the leg. Flexor hallucis longus wraps down here underneath an important little shelf on our heel bone, or the calcaneus. That's called the sustentaculum tali. And this tendon, as it flexes and snugs up, it helps hold the subtalar joint or pull the calcaneus up in a supportive position for the talus or the ankle bone. Now, these tendons continue on, especially flexor hallucis longus, pass through the sesamoid, or the little floating bones underneath our knee, and attaches out here on the tip of the big toe. So what that means is the toe flexor tendon get too long. But because these are also ankle movers, and what that means for the part of the muscle belly that controls whether our foot is in dorsa or plantar flexion, back here, because our ankle has already gone into some plantar flexion, that means the toe muscle bellies are too short. So this part of the toe extensor muscles that's responsible for helping pull up on the top of our foot for dorsiflexion, notice that because the foot is already plantar flexed, that the toe extensor bellies in role of are too long. So notice in each of these sets of toe muscles that help us keep the balance of how we coordinate our toes as well as coordinate the motion of our ankle, we have a section that's too long and a section that's too short in each of them. As we make the transition back to a plumb and neutral foot, we are helping hammer out new relationships between these imbalances. Now, our tissues adapt. The more that we do a repetitive motion in the same way every time, each one of these individual muscle bellies that goes down and crosses the ankle joint, you can think of them as like the strings on a marionette from the little cross up above, and it helps us change how that they relate to each other and how the thing at the bottom moves around depending on how we pull those strings. Well, if we're always pulling the thing on the bottom in the exact same way, and think of motion controlling footwear. If that footwear has a rigid arch support and a stiff bottom, then your marionette strings have not learned, also that means your nervous system, have not learned how to coordinate that relationship of individual motion for each one of these muscle bellies as needed depending on the terrain that you're standing on. So most folks, if you've ever gone on a really long hike or bike ride, you know that forward back stepping motion, constant and repetitive. Get to the place where you're dog tired the next day, or maybe that afternoon, you feel your quads and your thigh, and they feel like one big lump. You can't feel four of them. That's where all of those muscle bellies, instead of going, oh, I should move a little bit on each side, they're going, I always move the same. And so we learn to coordinate, and nobody is quite sure what's happening in the fascia when we stick together. There's lots of theories out there, but that's one of the exciting things is science is working really hard right now, and the researchers are working really hard right now to be able to explain how we change and modulate those relationships, thinking about the spaces between muscles. So all of these spaces between the individual muscle bellies are known as septa, or a single one is called a septum. Again, it's a dividing line. And typically, it's those septums and the nervous system that regulates how far the connective tissue that surrounds each muscle allows independent movement of those tissues. So motion controlling footwear, arch support, rigid shoes, they make us start to relate to our foot as though it's a paddle coordinated by these long marionette strings that come down from above, not like individual digits that we can choose to move in place however we'd like. So any motion patterns that are repetitive, or any tissues or joints that get stuck or immobilized in the foot, those relationships are going to be hammered out up here in the septa of the leg. So this portion of the muscle belly that is too short because our foot has learned to walk always in some state of plantar flexion, or that part of the muscle bellies of the dorsiflexors that are too long because we've learned to walk again with our foot always pointed down, those little spaces between along the whole muscle belly all the way up the leg as far up as they insert on the bone, those spaces between are going to be deciding just how far away from each other each tissue can go. And something else to think about that's really important in these spaces is it also happens to be where our nerves run. So we have common peroneal nerve, we have our tibial nerve. You can think of nerves like floss that you slide through your teeth. Just like the spaces between our muscles, it's like the spaces between our teeth. Those nerves learn how far they can glide to feel safe or not. And they will be trapped within these relationships and these imbalances. So some of the strategies that we need to think about when we are either making the transition ourselves to a more tactile and functioning foot capable of controlling its own motion, or when we're helping our clients do it, is we have to remember that these imbalances that happen at a single joint, it's not just at that joint. It's up in the space between and the relationships between each and every tissue. Now, in deep tissue massage or myofascial massage, there's several different names or techniques. I'm most familiar with separating compartments, which would be if I get my fingers down into this space between the gastrocs and then ask the client to actively move their ankle, they're going to start pulling those strings as I hold the space that I'm suggesting. And I know body workers, a ton of you have felt this already before. When you're working on a client, maybe you're doing a lengthening stroke with a fist or a knuckle or just with some fingers, where you know there should be a division between muscle bellies. Maybe it's the deltoid and the pec, but it feels all solid. But then you feel one of those bellies almost like a fillet just sliding away. Again, instead of moving all in the same plane, we make a little division there that allows some individual slide or glide. These relationships need to be sorted out and addressed all the way up the leg to help the foot find those new options for motion and how to support itself and coordinate movement. Now, the other really important thing that we need to think about is one of those other features of footwear, and this one is probably the most insidious and takes away your ability to control and support your own arch and choose how much you pronate or come back out of pronation into supination. If you want to learn more about that, check out my video called Big Toe Alignment and Arch Support Tensegrity. There's a link somewhere here. Check that out, you'll learn a lot more. It'll make a lot of sense when you see how I demonstrated that for us. But when we think about most athletic shoes, our shoe industry takes a width measurement at the ball of the foot, and then we tend to do something fashionable with the toes beyond there, tapering them. So, toe taper. That's the third footwear feature that really affects the ability for us to coordinate and keep our bones in the optimal structural alignment to give us the most choices for movement. Now, does this mean that this is a problem for everybody? No, absolutely not. Some folks can get away with a lifetime of using their foot in an imbalanced fashion and have no consequences whatsoever. Seems that the amount of strength that they have, the amount of proprioception and interoception, the ability to know your own feelings and what they mean, allow some folks a lot more ways to coordinate and hold themselves that don't ever seem to stress their tissues. But folks who do get into a very repetitive motion pattern and don't maybe have the same basic skill level or talent level, I think of this stuff as talent, just like there's so many guys that make it into the NBA each year. When it comes to coordination, relaxation, and movement, there's only a few of us that have that top level talent. The rest of us have to practice a lot and really hard just to get mediocre. And working these relationships for someone who is experiencing foot problems, leg problems, knee problems. I'll talk a little bit about the knee problems and the hip problems that can be influenced by these relationships as well, and why, as soon as I talk just a little bit more about toe taper. So the balance we really need to think about with toe taper, we need to think about a muscle called we need to think about a muscle that's called our abductor hallucis. And then we need to think about its partner or its antagonist called the adductor hallucis. So the adductor hallucis those two muscles help us control and grip with our big toe, but they both grip in opposite directions. So again, the adductor hallucis, ADD, has a transverse head which goes along the ball of the foot and hangs on to the inside of this big toe. And then it has an oblique head which comes from the base of the fifth metatarsal and also inserts on the same spot on the toe. When we tighten those, it helps us grip our big toe inward and comes together. And again, if you check out the big toe alignment and arch support tensegrity video, you'll see what that ends up doing to our ability to hold our own arch when we choose to grip with our toes inward versus the gripping that most of us have not had the opportunity to feel unless we grew up barefoot all the time or we have not spent a lot of time in posture deforming footwear. So the abductor hallucis comes from the calcaneus and attaches to the inside of, or I'm sorry, this side of the big toe. And when it tightens, it helps us pull our big toe out. So notice that if we have our bones pulling over into this shoe shape, this metatarsal, or this, I'm sorry, if we pull our foot over into shoe shape, this phalange comes inward and the outer one comes in as well. Where that becomes a bugger is when we're thinking about the role that the flexor hallucis longus muscle has as it relates to our big toe. Again, it attaches down here, runs all the way down the back of the leg, underneath the calcaneus, holding up the talus, and inserts on the big toe. I'm sorry, runs down on this side. When we deviate that, and it comes in here, the abductor hallucis has learned a locked long position. It is no longer in the advantageous position to be able to pull your big toe over. In my video, Big Toe Alignment and Arch Support Tensegrity, you will see the difference what happens when we learn a gripping sensation as confined by shoes. We're going to tend to fire this adductor hallucis, which causes our arch to spill into pronation. When we rehabilitate natural foot function, we learn to bring the abductor hallucis back online, and when it is co-contracted with flexor hallucis longus, it actually creates supination within our foot and stabilizes our arch and gives us the experience of a solid talus. When we can snug up the tension that we need to really make the support here firm, then we have the most options of how to relax our legs, hips, low back, rib cage on top of our feet. Really, by being down in our feet, spreading out, trusting our tension, we can rest as efficiently as possible on our feet. If for some reason we have trained coordination patterns where when we want to hold tight with our feet or really grip and get some power and this toe is inward, again, it causes the arch to want to pronate. Pronation in our foot equals internal rotation, usually for our tibia and our femur or our leg bone. So it's the same thing if there is a rigid structure or an arch support within the shoe and our foot wants to pronate onto that. If that's uncomfortable at all, having that arch support jammed up into our plantar fascia, then we are going to externally rotate our legs to lift weight up or control that weight that our arch can't support. If we look further up the chain, the tissues that we have that help us do that, some of the biggest, most powerful tissues that attach to our hip joints, our glutes, our external rotators, our psoas from the front, and our iliacus muscle from the front of our pelvis, they're all very powerful external rotators. So if that arch is not functioning, then we tense everything up the line to just keep ourselves from collapsing into that arch we can't trust. So this system being offline can create problems all the way up the chain. It can be connected to knee pain, hip pain, back pain, you name it. This is connected to it in some way. All right, another really important consideration that we need to think about. Standard treatment for plantar fasciitis, folks are saying, oh wow, that plantar fascia is too short. You know, there's the debates out there. Is it itis? Is it osis, which is tissue death? Probably a little bit of all of it. But something that's very important to keep in mind is this abductor hallucis muscle that attaches from the side of the big toe from the calcaneus, which is, this is where the plantar fascia attaches, is along the bottom of the foot. The plantar fascia's blood supply comes deep to the abductor hallucis muscle. So it gets its blood here, but we've got this big muscle going over the front of it. If I take the big toe and I taper it inwards, pulling this taut, that clamps off on that blood supply, which is very much a suspect in creating this plantar fasciosis, or the tissue death that occurs. And again, notice that this shoe position already places the plantar fascia in a stretched out position and over attenuates it. It also takes the tips of our toes out of their optimal alignment that would allow us to dome our own arches. Because again, if you think of a bowstring and there's a string that comes from the bottom of this toe here and then it tightens, this bow is going to come up. But if that string is already bent backwards, we really lose the structural advantage that we need to be able to lift our own foot. I hope I didn't confuse you too much with my drawing today. If you have any questions or confusions that I brought up, please comment with them below. I'll try to get to them as soon as I can, or use them as material to address in the next video. I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite exercises that I give clients and that I've done myself in the process of rehabilitating my own feet, but for building up the requisite strength that we need to be able to hammer out these new relationships that I'm talking about in our leg and foot. To address those imbalances of the toe flexors and extensors as they relate to ankle dorsiflexion, so toe extensors, toe flexors as they relate to dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, my favorite exercise to strengthen and teach differentiation between those roles is this one. You can hold your toes in extension, keep them pointed up at your nose, and keeping them pointed up, go through dorsa and plantar flexion for your foot. Now, you can flex your toes and, like you're gripping a pencil, keep them gripped, and again, go through dorsa and plantar flexion for your foot. The goal is to try to make this as coordinated and smooth of a motion as possible. Believe me, when you first try it, it's not going to probably look that way or feel that way. It'll probably go really stuttery. It'll get easier every time you do it. The next one, to train strong toes and that ability to keep our arches domable by our toe flexors when our toe tips, our ball of our foot, and our calcaneus are all on the same plane, is to teach ourselves to coordinate them individually. So you can lift your outer toes and flex your big toe into the ground. You're training your big toe powerful flexion into the ground. Now I can lift my big toe and flex my other digits into the ground. That's teaching my flexor digitorum longus how to coordinate itself individually and not in the same, there we go. And a clue too is when you're teaching yourself these things, you can use your hands to mimic the motion. The next exercise is bringing that flexor hallucis, the next exercise is bringing the abductor hallucis, abductor hallucis online. So we want to learn to bring our big toe over. Now I'm firing my adductor hallucis, the one that most folks in pointy-toed shoes know how to fire really strong. Now I want the adductor, again bringing my big toe out into straight alignment with my first metatarsal. If my abductor hallucis can hold that while I flex my flexor hallucis longus, notice my arch domes itself and my foot goes into supination. That is my pronation control that's built into my foot with tensegrity and coordination. Okay, so those are some great toe exercises to do. The next one would just be for working short foot musculature. You can grab a piece of paper and just try to crumple it into a ball between your heel. And you can do this while you're sitting on the couch at home. Just work it into a little smushy ball. That's going to help. Now, one of my favorite walking practices to change those coordination patterns as they go further up the leg. Here's another way you can put your foot down that will teach some opposite ways of lengthening, letting out length, relaxing musculature. You start by putting down the ball of your pinky toe, then your big toe, and your heel. And again, ball of pinky toe, ball of big toe, heel. So pinky toe, big toe, heel. And just walk around the room that way. Sometimes it's easier to go one foot in front of the other. It just teaches some new coordination patterns, probably the opposite of what many of you have been using for many, many years or a long time. One other thought, one other thing I found really helpful in the process of helping folks rehabilitate foot function and the ability to control their own motion are correct toes. Correct toes are a toe spacer that's meant to be worn while you are weight bearing, but inside of minimalist or non-posture deforming shoes. They're kind of like little silicone brass knuckles for your toes, but what it does is it uses the integrity of the four outer toes to help move the big toe out into that optimal alignment, as you saw in the big toe alignment and arch support tensegrity video, so that you can then keep the structure as you learn to coordinate and strengthen around it. Again, that co-contraction of flexor hallucis longus and abductor hallucis. These are a rehabilitative product for most folks. They don't need to continue using them forever. Some folks who have severe pathologies or came with like really crooked or overlapped toes or a severe bunion, they often choose to continue wearing them just because it makes them feel more secure that they won't go back. But for most folks, once you've worn these for about 6 months to a year and a half in minimalist footwear, again, footwear that allows your tips of your toes to be the widest point of your foot, not the ball like our foot industry takes width measurements at. You think of them as a workout, and as you strengthen, you'll notice that you gradually build up to being able to wear them weight bearing in those footwear all day that you're on your feet. As your foot becomes strong, capable, and communicative, for most folks there comes a day where one day you put it in your shoe and your foot says, "What is this crud that you've got stuck in here? I can use all this space on my own, thanks." And that's the day you know, hey, I can take that off. I'm going to just trust my foot to tell me if it likes what I'm doing with it or not. Anyways, another super helpful thing for rehabilitating natural foot function. These are over-the-counter products. You can buy them at transcendbodywork.com. You can also find them at various other places as well, probably close to you. They are an over-the-counter product that are just fine for body workers and massage therapists to offer in their retail offerings. If you liked what you learned here today, be sure you click like, subscribe, and share with your friends. All right, enjoy your happy feet. Hey, thanks for watching. Be sure you click subscribe and stay tuned.